I watched Veronica delete 18 months of my work with 3 clicks of her mouse while I stood behind her desk, holding 2 cups of coffee I'd bought to celebrate our partnership. The screen went black for half a second, then displayed her desktop wallpaper, some motivational quote about success belonging to those who take it. She spun around in her chair and looked up at me with those same brown eyes that had looked so grateful when I'd worked weekends to fix her coding mistakes, so apologetic when she'd asked me to put her name first on our joint patent application because the investors preferred dealing with her. The coffee was still warm in my hands when she said the company had decided to move forward with just her on the project, that my contributions were no longer needed, and that security would escort me out in 10 minutes. 27 other developers in that open office kept typing at their keyboards, but I could feel every single one of them watching me stand there like an idiot, holding coffee for someone who had just erased me. My name is Kieran, and before that morning, I lived between two worlds that somehow made perfect sense together. At Dataflow Solutions, I occupied the corner desk by the window where I could watch delivery trucks navigate the narrow street below while debugging complex algorithms. The code came naturally to me, had since I was 12 and built my first encryption program on my dad's old gateway computer. 28 years old, and I still got the same rush from solving problems that stumped other people. Evenings, I'd drive my Honda Civic 15 minutes across town to the small duplex I rented on Maple Street. The landlord never fixed the loose step on the front porch, so I'd learned to skip it entirely. Inside, my living room doubled as a workshop where I restored vintage electronics, old radios, tube amplifiers, anything with circuits that told a story. My neighbors thought I was weird, spending Saturday nights with a soldering iron instead of at bars, but there was something pure about bringing dead things back to life. The duplex was quiet except for Mrs. Patterson next door, who played her television too loud, and the college kids across the street who threw parties on Thursday nights. I'd made peace with both. This was my routine, my space, my life built on the simple idea that good work speaks for itself and trust means something. That's what I believed right up until I watched my entire professional existence disappear from a computer screen while holding coffee that had gone cold in my hands. If this story hits home, make sure you're subscribed. We tell these for a reason. Veronica started at Dataflow 6 months after me, hired as a junior developer when the company landed a contract to build a data security platform for 3 major hospitals. She sat 2 desks away and asked questions that showed she understood the basics, but struggled with the complex parts. I'd help her debug code during lunch breaks, explain why certain functions failed, show her shortcuts I'd learned over years of trial and error. She had this way of tilting her head when she listened, like she was genuinely grateful, genuinely learning. When she brought me coffee from the shop downstairs and said she'd never met someone who could make impossible problems look simple, it felt like recognition I'd been waiting for my whole career. The project was my design from the ground up, a custom encryption system that could protect patient data while allowing hospital networks to communicate seamlessly. I'd worked on similar problems in college, written papers that 3 professors said should be published. But Dataflow owned everything I created there, so when Veronica suggested we present the finished system together, I thought it made sense. Team effort, shared credit. The presentation went perfectly. Hospital executives nodded when Veronica explained the user interface, asked detailed questions when I walked through the security architecture. Afterward, our boss Marcus pulled us aside and mentioned the company was considering filing for a patent. Something about how the encryption method we developed could be licensed to other healthcare systems. That's when Veronica said the words that should have been my first warning. She asked if I'd mind if her name appeared first on the patent application, just because the clients had connected more with her during the presentation. It would look better from a marketing perspective, she explained. The important thing was that we'd both be credited as co-inventors. I said yes because I thought partnership meant something. I thought shared work meant shared ownership. I thought someone who brought me coffee and called me brilliant actually saw me as an equal. The meeting happened 3 weeks later on a Tuesday morning that started like any other. Marcus called me into the small conference room where Veronica was already sitting with 2 men I didn't recognize, lawyers, based on their identical navy suits and leather portfolios. Marcus explained that the patent application had been approved for filing, but there had been a change. The lawyers had reviewed the original code and project documentation, and they determined that Veronica's contributions constituted the primary innovation. My work was classified as technical support, implementation rather than invention. I felt my chest tighten as one of the lawyers opened his portfolio and pulled out papers covered in legal language. The official patent application listed Veronica Chin as the sole inventor. My name appeared nowhere except in a footnote acknowledging coding assistance. Veronica looked at her hands while Marcus explained that this was just a formality, that nothing would change about our working relationship. The lawyers nodded and mentioned that patent law was very specific about who qualified as an inventor versus who provided technical assistance. I asked to see the code review that had led to this decision. Marcus said it wasn't necessary to get into technical details, that the lawyers had consulted with outside experts who confirmed the analysis. That's when I realized Veronica hadn't said a single word since I'd entered the room. She sat perfectly still, staring at her hands, while my 18 months of work was legally transferred to her name only. The encryption algorithm I'd designed in my apartment, tested on weekends, perfected through dozens of iterations that she'd never fully understood, all of it was becoming hers with the stroke of a pen. I stood up from the table, and my chair made a scraping sound that seemed too loud in the small room. I asked if I could review the documentation myself, speak with the outside experts, understand exactly how they'd reached their conclusion. Marcus looked at Veronica, then back at me. He said the decision was final, that the lawyers had been thorough, that I needed to accept this was how intellectual property worked in the corporate world. I walked out of that conference room knowing I'd been played, but I still didn't understand how completely. I sat in my Honda in the Dataflow parking lot for 20 minutes before I could start the engine. My hands wouldn't stop shaking, and I kept replaying the meeting, looking for signs I'd missed, words that should have warned me. The drive home happened in a blur. I parked in my usual spot behind the duplex, climbed the loose front step I'd never bothered to fix, and stood in my living room surrounded by the vintage electronics that suddenly felt like toys for a man who couldn't protect his own work. I opened my laptop and pulled up the backup files I kept on a personal drive, every iteration of the encryption code, every design document, every late-night breakthrough I'd documented for myself. The timestamps were all there. Dates and times that proved I'd written every crucial function months before Veronica even understood what the system was supposed to do. But timestamps on personal files meant nothing against lawyers and corporate documentation that painted me as technical support. I closed the laptop and walked to the kitchen, where I made a cup of coffee I didn't want and stared at the wall calendar my mother had given me for Christmas. Today was circled in red, the day I'd planned to call her and tell her about the patent, about how her son, who'd always been better with computers than people, had finally created something important. Then I remembered something my dad had told me when I was 14 and got caught hacking into the school district's server. He'd been furious, but after the punishment, he'd sat me down and said one thing that stuck. The best defense against people who underestimate you is to let them keep doing it until it's too late. The idea came to me while I was soldering a capacitor in a 1960s radio that weekend. The circuit was simple: input, processing, output, but the magic happened in the components you couldn't see, the parts that made everything else function properly. I spent Sunday researching intellectual property law, reading court cases where solo inventors had successfully challenged corporate patents. Most of them failed, but the ones that succeeded had something in common. They could prove prior art, demonstrate that their innovation existed before the patent application was filed. My personal backup files were a start, but not enough. I needed something more concrete, more public, more impossible to dismiss. I remembered a programming forum where I'd posted code snippets for feedback during the development process. Technical communities where I'd asked questions about specific encryption challenges. GitHub repositories where I'd uploaded early versions of the algorithm for version control. I started documenting everything, creating a timeline that showed my work existed in public spaces months before Veronica claimed to have invented it. But every piece of evidence felt fragile, easy for lawyers to explain away or dismiss as unrelated to the final patent. My first real breakthrough came when I found my old college notebooks in a box under my bed. Margin notes and diagrams from 3 years ago, when I'd first started thinking about the healthcare data problem. Concepts that had evolved directly into the encryption system now credited to Veronica. But I made a mistake that nearly killed everything. I called my former professor, Dr. Williams, hoping he'd remember my early work on the project. Instead of supporting me, he suggested I might be misremembering my contributions, that collaboration often blurred the lines of individual achievement. That phone call left me sitting on my apartment floor at midnight, wondering if everyone saw me the way Veronica apparently did, as someone whose work mattered only when it supported someone else's success. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Mrs. Patterson knocked on my door on a Thursday evening, holding a manila envelope she'd found in my mailbox by mistake. The return address was from the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office, an official notice I hadn't been expecting. Inside was a standard form letter, but buried in the legal language was something that made my heart race. The patent application for the healthcare encryption system had been published for public review, which meant anyone could file an opposition if they believed the claimed invention wasn't original. I had 30 days to submit a formal challenge. I spent the next 2 weeks building an airtight case. Not just personal backups and forum posts, but something that would destroy Veronica's credibility completely. I requested the exact code submissions she'd made to the company repository, cross-referenced them with my original work, and found something beautiful. She hadn't just stolen my algorithm, she'd copied my comments and variable names exactly. Every piece of code she'd claimed as her innovation contained my fingerprints, programming quirks and naming conventions that were distinctly mine. Functions labeled with my initials in the comments. Error messages I'd written in my own voice. But the real weapon was simpler than I'd expected. While building my timeline of evidence, I discovered that Veronica's GitHub account showed zero activity before joining Dataflow. No previous projects, no coding history, no trace of the programming experience her resume claimed. I submitted my opposition to the Patent Office with 67 pages of documentation. Code comparisons, timeline evidence, public forum posts, and her complete lack of prior programming history. Everything organized with the same attention to detail I'd brought to the encryption system she'd tried to steal. The Patent Office responded within 2 weeks. They were launching a formal investigation and had suspended the application pending review. Veronica would need to provide evidence that she'd independently developed the technology claimed in the patent. 2 days later, Marcus called me into his office for a conversation that changed everything. Marcus looked older than I remembered, like the investigation had been keeping him awake. He closed his office door and asked me to sit down, his voice careful and tired. The Patent Office had contacted Dataflow directly, requesting all internal documentation related to the encryption system. Email chains, code repositories, project timelines, performance reviews, everything that could establish who had actually created what. Marcus had spent the weekend reviewing the evidence with the company's legal team, and the conclusion was unavoidable. Veronica had committed fraud. Not just against me, but against Dataflow itself. The company had filed a patent application containing false information, putting them at legal risk. Veronica's employment had been terminated that morning. The patent application would be withdrawn and refiled with accurate inventor information. And Dataflow was prepared to offer me a significant promotion, including a salary increase to $200,000 annually and a new title, Senior Cryptographic Developer. But there was something else Marcus needed to tell me. During the investigation, they discovered that Veronica had been interviewing with competitors, apparently planning to leave Dataflow once the patent was approved and take the technology with her to a new company. She hadn't just stolen my work, she'd planned to steal it twice. I accepted the promotion and the apology, but what I remember most clearly was the drive home that evening. The late afternoon sun coming through my windshield, the familiar route past the coffee shop where Veronica used to buy drinks she'd claimed were thank you gestures. I parked behind my duplex, climbed the loose step I still hadn't fixed, and sat in my living room with a vintage radio that suddenly worked perfectly. The sound was clear and warm, exactly the way I'd intended it to be. 3 months later, I was debugging a new security system when I got a message from a former Dataflow employee. Veronica had been hired by TechStart Innovations, a small company that specialized in healthcare software. She'd lasted exactly 6 weeks before being fired for submitting code that didn't work and couldn't explain how she'd written it. I never responded to that message, never felt the need to celebrate her failure. The revenge had already happened in the patent office documents, in Marcus's tired voice when he admitted the company had been wrong, in the moment she'd realized that stolen work eventually reveals itself. Sometimes I think about that morning when I stood behind her desk holding coffee, watching my life's work disappear with 3 clicks of her mouse. I understand now that she'd never seen me as a partner or a colleague. I'd been a resource to her, something to be used and discarded when no longer useful. But she'd made one crucial mistake. She'd assumed that quiet people don't fight back. The radio on my workbench still plays perfectly every evening, a reminder that some things, once you build them right, can't be destroyed by people who don't understand how they work.